Going to try to do a couple things today. I'm going to talk through some of the issues that I've been writing about related to unintended consequences and systems, and kind of talk about my process and talk about some of the themes that I've been covering for the last couple of years. And we can, as much as possible on Zoom, we can keep this like a discussion. If you want, use the chat. It might be a little easier to do that than trying to talk in a group, but we can leave it natural. We can see how it goes. So I'm going to talk through some things, but I'm happy to also have a discussion as people are interested in other topics or want to bring up related topics. So I'm going to share my screen again, just to talk through some of these issues. And okay, here we go. So just an update on how this project for me started. So a couple of years ago, I started writing about this topic and unintended consequences or systems, second order effects. This is a big topic. It's a very broad topic. It intersects with just about everything. So I really started because it was it was interesting to me, and I was noticing different things in the news and history and things I was reading and things I was experiencing. And what was a very much a side project, well, it still is a side project, but it's become something that I do on a regular basis. Once a week with time off for holidays, I will write a new piece related to something that might be in the news, something I'm observing. And my process is pretty natural, I'd say. I don't really plan things more than a few days ahead. I tend not to, kind of have a schedule of what I'm going to write about, as long as it's interesting and I think it's relevant for, readers. I'm going to look into it. But the question of why now, or why am I doing this now? Why is it important, and why is this the time? I think it's worth addressing. And I'm going to just show a quote from a book that I referenced maybe a couple of weeks ago called The Logic of Failure. And this kind of sums it up for me. So a quote from the book is, very early on, human beings developed a tendency to deal with problems on an ad hoc basis. The task at hand was to gather firewood, drive a herd of horses to a canyon, build a trap for a mammoth. These were problems of the moment, usually had no significance beyond themselves. The need to see a problem embedded in the context of other problems rarely arose. For us, however, this is the rule, not the exception. And I think you'll find this again and again. There's more connections across the world. Noticeably more connections even in, say, half a generation. Connections could be geographic. Travel is easy. Apart from this year, travel has gotten a lot cheaper, a lot more accessible. Connections, that are digital, of course, have made the world a lot more connected. It's possible to have a change that occurs in one part of the world impact a lot of people somewhere else, and we don't necessarily naturally think about those things. So I think this theme, unintended consequences, it's only become more relevant. And in the past, I tried to break down unintended consequences in different categories, as others have done. And I've written about different categories of them in the past and how they each work. And I've also taken a paper that was written maybe 80, 90 years ago by Robert Merton on the causes of unintended consequences, and I've kind of used that as a starting point earlier for me when I was learning more about this topic. But for the rest of the talk, we can certainly have side discussions that go on. The rest of the talk, I thought I'd introduce some of the major themes that I've written about with some examples, And I hope this, if you haven't read these pieces, that's fine, but I hope it stirs some thoughts for you. So let's talk about the first example here, scaling effects. And there are many examples of this. What is a scaling effect? I'll kind of describe it as something that maybe didn't exist before emerges and it's growing and it becomes big, or it's just growing fast. And this can have this unintended outcome. Could be somewhere else in the world because of this fast growth, something that's really scaling up. And wanted to give an example. It's a little bit of an unusual example, but I've written about rhino horns a couple times in the past. And the reason this was interesting to me was, the rhinoceros doesn't know what's causing the extra attention that they're getting, say from poachers or from tourists. The rhino doesn't understand that. But in an example, both from, say, the last generation and also specifically from this year, has been rhino horn traditionally has been seen as a medicine in a number of different places. Largely China and Taiwan. So here are a couple countries that have become wealthier just in, say, the last generation. There are significant populations who can afford to pay tens of thousands of dollars per kilo for rhino horn, to be collected, to be used as a medicine. So you have this growth in wealth. You also this year had the emergence of a disease where one of the supposed cures for it was rhino horn. And yeah, I'm talking about COVID. So when you look at those two changes, one that's maybe relatively slow over a generation, one that's pretty quick within a year, and then you also have a decline of tourism. So something that was going to keep keep value in living rhinos rather than poached rhinos that have been with the horn that's cut off. Tourism has fallen. There's still wealth. There's extra demand because of this disease. You have a lot of pressure put on rhino horn, and it's an example of something where the demand is taking place in one part of the world. The supply is somewhere very different. There's a lot of different actors that have a part in this. And it's not really the first thing that you might think of when you think of wealth creation, an economy modernizing, a new disease emerging. But this effect happens again and again, and I've written about it in a number of different ways. Both in scale effects from Airbnb. A lot of good things come from Airbnb, but you also have examples where, like, a resort town, all of a sudden, people who live there year round are priced out because during the busy season, it makes no, they can't afford to rent, or they can never get a one-year lease because the landlord can make more money during the busy season than they could renting at a normal rate for the rest of the year. Same thing with Uber and Lyft in certain markets where there are established taxi commissions. Uber and Lyft, largely good, but if you are a taxi driver and you've paid a lot of money for a taxi medallion and you were doing everything, quote unquote, right, this new entrant comes in and it dramatically changes the value of what has been typically like the biggest investment that a taxi driver would make, say at least in New York. And same thing largely for for tourism. That's a picture on the lower right from Venice. You have a number of places around the world that, because of their beauty or fame, they get incredible amount of attention as especially tourism became a lot easier. And you see these scale effects in many different parts of the world, many different activities. So this was a theme of mine, and I like to think of it as, I'm not saying, okay, well, therefore, let's not allow Airbnb or Uber or tourism, or let's shut down all these innovations. Instead, let's just appreciate how they have other effects as well. Another theme for me has just been understanding the connectivity there. And there's obviously a lot of overlap in these themes, right? But what are some of the systems that underlie behavior that we see? So something I wrote about earlier on was a friend of mine from Russia, but he was in the US when this happened. He wrote a Facebook post where he apologized for, repented, I think he said, repented for like the last 100 years of Russia's history. So you might say, well, okay, that's an interesting post. It's one person doing this. He was not someone famous. He was not somebody who would be in the news. This post eventually led to like a lot of attention, including his picture in newspapers in Russia with a description of what he did, and an incredible amount of largely negative reaction to what he wrote, including lots of threats. Long story short, he was granted asylum in the US as a result of all this happening. But when I think about like how is it that this actually happened, like why did this extreme reaction occur and result in even a need for him to apply for asylum? Well, here with if you consider like connectivity, here again, he makes this post on social media. Most posts are ignored. This one happened to get some attention. The more attention it got, begat even more attention. It blew up, got an incredible amount of attention internationally. And you wouldn't really see that effect had it not been for the creation of user-generated content, the ability to like, comment, share posts. In a more traditional news environment, this story would never have been heard. His post would never have been heard except outside of, say, a handful of his friends or maybe a local publication. Instead, his story went around the world, and it probably especially to people who reacted in an extreme way, negative or positive, and resulted in a very different outcome for him. And again, I think we see something like this again and again. And another theme I've written about has also been optimization versus an appreciation for the systemic risk that you might bring in to a system. So I've written about this in a number of ways. One way, though, was talking about autonomy or vehicle autonomy. So I posed the thought experiment in a post from maybe a couple of years ago. What would it take to, instead of trying to make driving safer, what would it take to increase traffic deaths per capita? And I posed this both in the current state where there's human drivers and in a future state where we have higher level autonomous vehicles. They're truly autonomous, not like the ones that we have today. You get in the vehicle and it just knows where to go, and you get out. And it's a little unusual maybe to argue against the current state. Like the current state is not great. Even in the US, which is a pretty safe driving environment, you have 3,000 fatalities a month. This has gone down over the decades, but it's quite significant, right? 3,000 a month. What happens in the projected best case with autonomous vehicles? Hard to put a number on it, but a lot of what you hear is that 3,000 gets pushed way down. Maybe it's not zero, but it's something close to zero, a lot better than where it is today. And that's where I often saw that discussion end. People would even claim, like, why on earth would you want a human being to be in charge of this fast-moving, heavy object? People are careless, they make mistakes, they drink and drive, they drive when they're tired. Why on earth would you choose to have 3,000 fatalities a month when you could have something like this? And if I'm somebody, behind the research for autonomous vehicles, I'm working at that company, I understand that argument. That is the whole purpose of the business. But what are some of the other effects that could happen, right? So now I've really changed the system. People are not driving, the cars are driving themselves. What are some of the effects that could also happen? Well, do people become riskier or playful? Something that I saw all the time when living in New York was just the degree that pedestrians would kind of play with the vehicles on the street, especially if it's a big limousine. You'd get in front of it, you'd smack the side of it, you'd almost like encourage, I don't say you, but I mean like others who I've observed, like you'd almost see people encourage danger a bit because they're reacting to what kind of car that is. So this is something that I think there's not that much appreciation for. Do humans actually change their behavior knowing that the cars are going to try to avoid them? What happens also if there is something like a hack or a bug that can propagate through a fleet or through some area? Even if it's resolved quickly, do you, instead of seeing that line stay close to zero for fatalities, do you see every once in a while a spike that goes up? That might be better overall if I'm just counting fatalities, but you're swapping relative certainty for relative uncertainty. And this is, again, an area where like there's a lot of money being put into AV development. I think it's almost been taken as, well, maybe not as aggressive as people thought, 5 years ago or so, but this is going to happen at some point. I don't think there's been a good discussion of like what are the systemic risks that are going to be introduced if you swap out a human driving population for a largely autonomous vehicle population of cars. And then there's second order effects, and again a lot of overlap between these themes. But sticking with the autonomous vehicles concept, there have been a lot of articles written, I found, by other publications about this idea when we have autonomous vehicles, there's going to be a shortage of organs to be donated for people who need them. And I started looking into this and I thought, well, this is very interesting. Like I hadn't thought about this before. And ended up concluding after some research that this was actually not a risk at all. And this is where I really say, this is a potential second order effect. I don't think it is actually a risk because the supply of organs from car accidents is pretty small. And if anything, organ donations or organ transplants, it's largely, say, demand driven. Like we come up with new techniques. A lot of these techniques were not available even in just like a couple decades ago. Now we have more, ability to make a safe organ donation. It's more being driven by that innovation on the medical side and the demand that people have for them. I think that you would overcome any shortage, even if you can push traffic fatalities way down. You could overcome any shortage simply by encouraging more people to donate, say at time of death or for other causes. And as I also referenced in that article, the increasing deaths from, say, drug overdoses are more than making up for any potential shortfall, here. And this is an example of where I thought, if you just dig a little into this topic, I think you come to a very different conclusion than what these publications were proposing. And that was kind of, maybe also a side theme of what I would see. Maybe not enough attention paid to some of the details or just like actually trying to go into some of the numbers. A recent post also on second order effects was in how a decision that seems to be very good can lead to bad outcomes, again, unintentionally. So in the US, in recent years, especially, like I live in California, especially in California, we've seen pretty bad wildfires. Some of this is definitely attributed to climate change, but what are some of the underlying effects that create the ability for these fires to take place? So about 100 years ago in the US, there started to be active measures to suppress wildfires. And as a result, through like the national parks and other initiatives to fight these fires that were emerging. As a result, you have forests today that look very different than they did 100 years ago in terms of the density of trees. The past was small fires are common. They happen all the time. They're pretty local, and you get that burning out or clearing out of the small trees, the underbrush. If you start to prevent that from happening, and you get this extra density of trees and other small brush, what happens is you've just created forests that are much more liable to have a large fire spring from them. So we're trying to do the right thing by suppressing fires, and the result ends up being we have a greater risk of big fires. Didn't mean for this to happen, but it was a second order effect of the action that we took 100 years ago. After 100 years, it's very difficult to reverse that, right? Very difficult to go and start to clear out millions of acres of small trees and brush. Similar change that I'd say not intentional, but a second order effect that happened from news publications moving from being geographically focused, like a print paper distributing to a city or like a couple hundred miles radius around that city, to internet distribution and advertising centered and subscription centered business models. In the past, when it's geographically centered, more common to have a publication be a little more middle of the road. After all, you had a wide range of say political views in that geography. With internet distribution, you can find that little niche that kind of is a fit for just about anything. And if it's supported, say today, as more publications are supported mostly through a subscription. In fact, you can even have publications that just have, say, a few thousand paid subscribers, really niche. You can have any extreme view, that publication kind of centers around, and that's enough. So a changing business model and changing technology can lead to more extreme bias in the news, more polarization of a population. This is something that you've certainly seen in the US over the last 20, 30 years as this business model change happened. Nobody intended for this to happen, I'd say, but you could say this is a result. This polarization is a result of a changed business model. And, of course, some fun ones like, I've written about plague, a few times in the past, but I had not realized the potential connection to the tulip bubble that plague had. When you have high mortality rate, you have inheritance money with a smaller number of survivors, and tulips become an investment vehicle, and it's like a feedback loop that occurs there. Same thing for cheap storage and computer processing power, leading to both free email, but also surveillance. We've certainly seen the emergence of both of those businesses in the last decade or so. One of the last themes I'll touch upon today is just going back to primary sources. And what I mean by this is part of my process has been to make sure that I'm understanding something well enough to really be able to write about it, rather than just repeat. Maybe a month or two ago, I wrote a post called "Is the World Getting Safer?" And one of the claims, and because you often hear that claim, the world is safer today than it was in the past. One of those claims has been based around a measure of homicides per capita. And there's been a lot of criticism of using this measurement because past data wasn't necessarily really reliable. But maybe we can say, well, I can't trust sources from centuries ago, but I can probably trust them from decades ago, at least in places where we have collected homicides per capita, pretty accurately. And it has trended downward. How can you not say the world is getting safer as a result? And there was a paper published that was looking at this. Again, not something that I've seen get a lot of attention, but the claim is actually homicides per capita is not a good way of looking at safety. If instead you look at assaults per capita, it's actually kind of a flat line. And I think they were focused on the US from, if I remember right, like the 60s to maybe the 90s. If you look at assaults per capita, it's pretty much a flat line. But what's changed? You have better medical treatment. So homicides decreases, but assaults remains flat. So if you're the person who is potentially affected by the violence, the rate of assault stays the same, but you're more likely to survive. I'm not sure if you consider that to be safer or not, but it's a little different story than you might have expected. And it's an example of why I like going back to like some of the primary sources, or like really trying to figure out what is behind the numbers that are that are discussed. Last theme I'll talk about is system shocks. So we've seen a lot of these, right? Certainly this year. So I wrote a 5-part series on coronavirus, and then I stopped counting them, and I wrote a few more after that. But I wrote the first 5 in February and March of this year, and it was a story that I had been following for a little while. I was interested to write then, and while I certainly didn't know how big that story would become, I wrote back then in early February because this seemed to be an example of an exponential process that was taking place. And I had lived in Hong Kong and worked in China quite a bit earlier in my career. I actually had left Hong Kong shortly before the SARS epidemic of 2003, 2004. So had a little relevance there. And I was, in fact, I'm not going to show these 2 videos. I was going to show them, but the first video I was going to show was how serious this was being treated in China. And this is a video from February 2020 that I linked to in the first coronavirus post that I wrote, where you have like barren scenes. There's like an empty field with one person in it, and a drone approaches and tells them, "What are you doing out? Put your mask on, go home." There's nobody around. And then they kind of repeat this in a number of places. And it made me think, that's you're being pretty serious with this. There must be more of a story here than we realized just yet. The second video was one I also referred to in the first article. It was someone with a mask on from Wuhan complaining about the way things were being handled. And this was a video that had a lot of popularity. That second video is gone. And I assume after things settled down a bit, that video was intentionally removed, and the person was probably identified. So as a system shock, there are many outcomes of COVID. We've seen, not just on the health side, but economic, tourism, travel, national perspectives. And this is just one recent example of system shocks. We see these all the time, right? They seem to be rare, but we actually see them all the time. And I was, I had earlier written about plagues, a number of different times. So I was already kind of interested, in this topic, but I also saw like a disconnect between people who are talking a lot about this and, just this appreciation of systemic risks in history. And one of the later posts that I wrote, where I included this image of, here's the white suit that you see, now on the left, and then the old, the plague doctor outfit, where it's, largely doing the same thing, maybe in a more fashionable way. But what were some of the reactions back in February and March from people who I'd say might know better if they thought maybe a little bit more about systems or about unintended consequences? And I highlighted a couple from one of those posts. And the interesting thing to me was, so in the post on the left, so here's somebody who says, on the worst days of coronavirus in China, 108 people died, but on a given day globally, 26,000 people died of cancer, 49,000 people die of cardiovascular disease. So have people who are in an exponential growth infectious disease environment with COVID being compared to diseases that, if somebody with cardiovascular disease walks into a crowded room, they don't spread that, right? So they're not really comparable. And on the right, a critique of excessive fear of coronavirus, calling it probability neglect. So you're being too fearful because you have this probability neglect, whatever that is, even though we don't really understand that much about what's going to happen with this disease yet. So the ironic thing for me is the person on the left calls themselves an exponential entrepreneur, but kind of missed an exponential process, and the person on the right was later hired to become the World Health Organization, one of the technical leads there. So it was a little ironic to see that for both of them. Disinformation was also a theme in terms of a system shock. And again, sticking with the disease topic, one of the really well documented intentional disinformation campaigns that was led was called Operation Infection. And it was to create the idea that the HIV virus was created in a government lab, like a CIA lab. This was a multi-year effort where they used a technique that I have seen in marketing, in marketing terms called trading up the chain, where you plant a little story in a minor publication for the purpose of referencing that story by a little larger publication, for the purpose of then having a significant publication reference the medium-sized publication claim. And eventually you find a scientist in the case here, this was a Soviet program in the 80s, but you find an East German scientist who's willing to actually back some of this up with some research. The result was, of course, you don't need to convince everybody in the world, but at one point, 15% of Americans actually believed that HIV had been created in a government lab. So you imagine what that can do to a public health type of effort. If you think like the information that you're getting is from the very people who were behind the creation of the disease. I think we're going to see more and more examples of this in the future. If we don't see the example, it might still be there. Another system shock I'll kind of end with is UBI, so Universal Basic Income. This got a lot of attention during the last presidential campaign. Also got a lot of attention during the economic fallout from COVID in the US. But I'll say there's a lot of uncertainty over what would change when we bring something like this in. And this is a big top-down program. A program to the scale that it's significantly larger than any other government program in the US. How do you reverse UBI if it's not working the way that you want. It might be very difficult. How do you actually run an experiment to test this? There are many local experiments where there might be 100 or 1,000 people given, say, $1,000 a month. Very different from everybody getting that, where there's going to be some impact on, well, rents will go up, other costs will increase. So here again, I think, good intentions behind the idea, but we don't necessarily understand the effects of it. And I think it's, it's something worth trying to understand a bit more. So I'm going to start to wrap up, and if you want, we can have a discussion. I'll hang around. But if you're interested to learn more about this, in terms of what you can do personally, you might just start considering what are the changes that a change might beget. I find that we often just take one step into that thinking. Take a second step and think, okay, well, this change happens. What are some of the other things that might also happen as a result? Be careful with top-down, large-scale projects, especially ones which, we've thought everything out perfectly. There's one implementation, and then we're done. And now we're in this future state where everything's better. Things backfire, go differently all the time. So again, be careful with something that's large and top-down. Could you do it a little more naturally? Could you actually run an experiment that is valid in order to see, are we on the right track or not? I like trying to map out the system that is potentially impacted. So literally by drawing the map of that, as I have it on a couple of the other articles I wrote. And of course, expect to be surprised. So if you like the writing I've been doing, I just recently put my essays up, kind of packaged on Amazon. You can check that out.